Good morning. It is Thursday, March the 17th, and this is The Drill. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So after the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare, the Pledge of Allegiance, and the Star-Spangled Banner, we will have no free lunch, pie, Tammany Hall, private organizations, rebel states, union tribbles, bankruptcy, Why Johnny Can't Read, and Final Frontier, all from the introduction to the book Shadowbosses. All that and more when I come back. Thank you. And now the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare for March the 17th. You will uproot any roots of wickedness from your life. Take heed to walk in the way of goodness and keep to the paths of righteousness. For my upright and blameless children will dwell in my land, but the wicked will be cut off from the earth, and the unfaithful will be uprooted from it. I have this day given you my authority and power over the nations and over the kingdoms to root out and to pull down, to destroy and to throw down, to build and to plant. My axe is already at the root of the trees, and every tree that does not produce good fruit will be cut down and thrown into the fire. But if your roots are holy, so will be your branches. When I grafted you into the true vine, which is my Son, you now share in the nourishing sap from the olive root. But remember this, you do not support the root. My Son Jesus is the root who supports you. Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 10, Romans chapter 11, verses 17 through 19, and Hebrews chapter 12, verse 15. Prayer declaration. I lay the axe to the root of every evil tree in my life. Let every ungodly generational taproot be cut and pulled out of my bloodline in the name of Jesus. Let the roots of wickedness be as rottenness. I speak to every evil tree to be uprooted and cast into the sea. Let every root of bitterness be cut from my life. Let your holy fire burn up every ungodly root in the name of Jesus. Amen. And that was the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare for March the 17th. Thank you. Who is the true conservative? He is religious and realistic. He is the person that understands that culture is the foundation for politics. He acknowledges a benevolent universe. He is patriotic and uses common sense. He makes judgments, refuses to speculate, speaks clearly and definitively, and is not afraid to say no. He's open-minded, asking why rather than why not. He is consistent, credible, and influential, not ashamed of his existence, unafraid to learn or correct his mistakes. He is a normal American. Thank you, thank you. What are the tactics in support of the strategy to rid America of socialist influence? The long-term tactics are to be a true conservative, talk like a conservative, act like a conservative, dress like a conservative, and think like a conservative. The short-term tactics are rhetorical. True conservatives need to win all of the arguments. That means don't prove a negative. Don't take their word for it. Don't be neutral, and ask plenty of questions. Thank you, thank you. What is the true conservative strategy for defeating socialists in this country? Socialists must be driven from positions of power, and since it is lefty counterculture that provides the foundation for their political success, true conservatives must resist left-wing counterculture and promote normal American culture. By changing our culture, we will change our politics. And by changing the culture, we mean you need to get married, have a family, and raise your children. Thank you, thank you. What are the true conservative political priorities? Number 1, the abolition of abortion throughout the land. Number 2, to make nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons obsolete. Number 3, the immediate decertification of all public employee unions. Number 4, the immediate assignment of criminal and civil liabilities to all government regulators. Number 5, the immediate repeal of the so-called Patriot Act. Number 6, the immediate repeal of all so-called emergency dictator laws. Thank you, thank you. And now there's no free lunch. The universe is full of dots. Connect the right ones and you can draw anything. The important question is not whether the dots you picked are really there, but why you chose to ignore all the others. Russ Roberts. One of the most profound insights in the books. Standing in the way of the knowledge that may enable authoritarians to command the affairs of society is not merely the lack of basic information, but also the inability to discern what they do see. The knowledge problem extends to what cannot be known and what cannot be understood in proper context from what is seen. And that was There's No Free Lunch. Thank you, thank you. And now, taxpayers versus tax receivers from the book Shadowbosses about public employee unions. Government employee unions have figured out that in America today there are just two groups of people, the net taxpayers and the net tax receivers. You're probably in the first category. You, the taxpayer, are the kind of person who has a productive job. Maybe you are a member of a private sector union, but in any case, you make our nation's pie. While you are working hard making pie, government employee unions are busy taking pie and redistributing it to themselves and government employees. They eat the pie that you make, and they're not the only ones. More than 50% of the American population now receives more from the government than they pay in, and the percentage of these net tax receivers is growing every day. Net tax receivers naturally tend to favor the growth of government because they benefit from it. Taxpayers tend to oppose it because it costs them when government grows. Our nation doesn't have much of a problem where a small percentage of people in our nation are net tax receivers. The problem arises when the percentage of people who draw their support from government, including government employees, is so high that it imperils our nation's economic growth. That is where we are heading. Those of us who make the pie are not organized into a group battling the growth of government. We have our own lives to live. We're just trying to keep enough pie to feed our families. We don't have time to march against those who want to steal our pie, even while government employee unions tell their members to rally against greedy pie makers, particularly big companies and the so-called 1%. Many government employee union bosses, though, are the true 1%, living off of the rest of us. Many union bosses receive salaries and benefits approaching or exceeding $500,000. Countless other union officials make generous salaries that are multiple times what their union members make. For example, at the national headquarters of America's largest labor union, the National Education Association, over half of the employees make over $75,000 in salary a year, and 31 employees make over $200,000 in salary a year, not including generous benefit packages. It's good to be a pie eater. Back in a minute. Thank you. New Tammany Hall. Government employee unions aren't just bankrupting our economy, they're also compromising our system of free elections. Unlike the private sector unions that came before them, government employee unions use bought and paid for politicians to help create legislations granting them unending benefits. Together, government employee unions and their paid for politicians destroy all semblance of transparent and open government. Want to know what happened to your country? It was bargained away by our elected representatives who were paid for lock, stock, and barrel by those government employee unions. Government employee unions are the new Tammany Hall. Senator Jim DeMint is even more to the point. Quote, the unions are the most powerful political group in the country today. Their power in politics is unprecedented. And without the unions, the Democrat Party fades away. Unquote. As a former Labor Department official told us, people think that the labor movement is a subsidiary of the Democrat Party. They are wrong. Today, the Democrat Party is a subsidiary of the labor movement. And the power and money in today's labor movement is centered on the government employee unions. These unions will do anything in their power to elect politicians who will serve their interests. They'll spend huge amounts on politics, send in political ground troops to get out the vote, flood the airways with negative advertising to destroy their opponents, whatever it takes to win elections. And as government employee unions rise in power, the Democrat Party gets closer to becoming the permanent party in power. It's not as though nobody saw this coming. Not so long ago, even liberals agreed that it was illegal and inappropriate to give labor unions the power to act as exclusive bargaining agents for government workers against our government. Even union bosses thought government employee unions were a non-starter. Quote, it is impossible to bargain collectively with the government, unquote, wrote George Meany, the newly installed chief of the AFL-CIO. A few years later, the governing council of the AFL-CIO affirmed that government workers have no right to bargain collectively with the government beyond the ability to petition Congress, a right available to every citizen. The point was obvious to everyone at that time. No organization should have special rights to demand government cash for a certain group of Americans. To grant such special rights to one interest group would be to compromise the integrity of our republic. Money now flows from government employee unions to politicians and back again to the same unions in a never-ending cycle of greed and corruption. Now, virtually all Democrats and even a few Republicans in Congress and legislatures across the country promote legislation giving unions more and more power over our government and its employees. All the while, the politicians know that union money will cycle right back to them in return for their pro-union votes. So, you say, I get it. The government employee unions spend huge dollars on politics to get favors from government officials. But so does the oil industry, the banks, and nearly every other industrial lobby. Why are government employee unions any worse for America than these groups? No question about it, crony capitalism is terrible, but crony unionism is far more pernicious. Let's look at just three major differences between how government employee unions and corporate America operate. First, government employee unions trample the rights of workers by forcing them to pay dues as a condition of their employment and to support political causes they don't believe in. As economist Arthur Laffer recently wrote, most high school civics students would agree that no American worker should either be prohibited from joining a union or required to join one as a condition of employment. And no union member, or anyone else for that matter, should be required to contribute to political causes they oppose. Yet, that is exactly what unions do to workers when they forcibly unionize them. Corporations don't do that, nor are many private sector workers forcibly unionized anymore. Second, government employee unions imperil our communities by having the power to call essential workers on strike, and doing this even if such strikes are technically illegal, as we will see. If private sector workers are called out on strike by their union, some people may be inconvenienced. If essential public safety workers like policemen or firefighters, or even our unionized border patrol agents, for example, go on strike, whether legally or illegally, communities suffer far worse fates. Third, while corporations may hire lobbyists to represent their interests before our government, at least the corporations actually contribute to the growth of our economy by making products and providing services that make the pie bigger and make America more competitive. When government employee unions lobby our government, they are really just lobbying to make our government bigger, which weighs down our economy as a whole. Unions partner with government officials to grow the size of government, to hire more government employees, and to grant them more compensation. Then these unions keep our government inefficient by preventing it from reorganizing, streamlining, and privatizing government services. Because a more efficient government would mean less union dues revenue. There will be a tipping point when our government gets so big that the last remaining taxpayers in America will no longer be able to support the enormous cost of running our government. And we are rapidly approaching this point. Back in a minute. Thank you. Private organizations for private benefit. It is important to realize that government employee unions, like all unions, are private organizations. Unions feed off the largesse of government for the benefit of their members and union bosses. Government employee unions get their business directly from our government, but are not themselves a part of the government. Unions represent government employees because that is their business. Albert Shanker, who served as the head of the American Federation of Teachers from 1974 to 1997, is credited with saying, "When school children start paying union dues, that's when I'll start representing the interests of school children." Although it is hotly disputed whether or not he actually said this, the quote hammers home the point that the union's sole function is to represent their members, not to work toward goals that may be in our nation's interests. Unions act in the interest of the unions themselves, not the public good. We must never forget that unions are run for the benefit of union bosses and their members and are not benevolent organizations. Back in a minute. Thank you. Rebel states. 24 states are right-to-work states, meaning that these states have right-to-work laws that protect most private sector workers against being fired if they don't join a union or pay dues. Government workers in these states are generally also given right-to-work protections, but not all workers in these states are protected against being forced to pay union dues. For example, airline and railroad employees are not protected by right-to-work laws no matter where they live or work. This is because the Federal Railway Labor Act governs these workers and trumps state right-to-work laws. So pilots at United and American Airlines, for example, are unionized and are forced to pay union dues even if they live and work in right-to-work states. In right-to-work states, though, most workers have a choice as to whether or not to financially support a union. Not so in the other states. The forced dues states that don't protect this important right. In forced dues states, a union that controls a group of workers under a collective bargaining contract can force every last one of those workers to pay union dues or be fired, including state and local government employees. And because so many workers are forced to pay union dues in forced dues states, unions earn most of their dues income in these states. Just because right-to-work states don't generate much dues income for unions, it doesn't mean that unions leave these states alone. The Shadowbosses have long tentacles. Unions spend considerable money earned in the forced dues states to influence politics and policy in the right-to-work states. And government employee unions maintain a web of paid political organizers in every congressional district in America to make sure that their reach covers our entire nation. Unions are far more involved in politics and policy in right-to-work states than most people believe. Back in a minute. Thank you. Union tribbles. Government employee unions are always working to expand their membership and to organize new groups of workers. They're like the tribbles in Star Trek. They seem harmless until they clog up the essential functions of the ship, in this case, our government. To keep their dues business growing, government employee unions are reaching beyond merely representing government workers. Unions have been working to organize new groups of workers who are not employees of the government or any company, but who receive subsidies from the government. In a number of states, government employee unions have already forced parents who care for their disabled children and people who care for their aging parents into unions and made them pay dues. The next step is to expand this organizing model to new groups of Americans: Social Security recipients, disability recipients, veterans, welfare moms, food stamp recipients, and other groups that receive government funds and benefits. Think about it. There are 3.5 million civilian employees who work for the federal government, making it the largest single employer in America, and around 17 million people work for our state and local governments. The unions are already representing 8.3 million of them, but there are also tens of millions of Americans who receive some benefits or entitlements from the government who could also be unionized with a few tweaks to existing laws. Imagine how much more income unions could generate by representing them as well. What does all this mean in practical terms? The unbridled growth of crony unionism and government corruption will destroy the United States as we know it. Not just crazy deficits or nutty benefits packages, utter ruin. We're almost there already. Back in a minute. Thank you. Bankrupting America. The enormous costs of paying state and local government employees is tearing through state and local budgets. It's bad in every state of the nation, though of course it's much worse in states with heavily unionized government employees and where unions are permitted to extract forced dues from workers. Government employee costs, generous salaries, benefits, and pensions have grown exponentially, and in union-controlled states, these costs can't be reduced without the consent of the unions. Union-negotiated contracts make it nearly impossible for union-controlled states to bring their budgets into line, putting them in a far more precarious financial condition than less unionized states, which have more flexibility to right-size as needed. Not coincidentally, states with the longest and strongest history of government employee unions are also the states with the worst budget crises. Of the 10 states with the highest debt per capita in 2010, all of them are heavily unionized and none of them are right-to-work states. Congress has even heard testimony that identified government employee unions as a major contributing factor, perhaps the major contributing factor to our state and local budgetary crisis. Back in a minute. Thank you. Why Johnny can't read. Another crisis in America is our failing K-12 education system. The blame for this problem can be laid at the feet of two teachers' unions, the National Education Association and the American Federation of Teachers. That's because the unions negotiate the teachers' contracts that determine who gets hired, who gets fired, what teachers teach, how they are trained, and ultimately whether American students are competitive with the rest of the world. Let's be honest, if you were to imagine an ideal K through 12 program for the 24th century, would you select a 9.5-month program that breaks for 10 weeks in the summer? Would you choose a 170 to 180 day school year when Americans' competitors have a school year of 220 days or more? Would you need to spend an average of nearly $11,000 a year per school child, not including the cost of school buildings and infrastructure? Would you build extensive infrastructure that is only used 7 to 8 hours a day for only part of the year? Our school schedule makes sense when we lived according to the agrarian calendar and we needed our kids to help us in the fields during planting and harvest. But now we are competing with China and India and many other nations whose children go to school for more hours a day and more days a year than ours do. We need a school calendar that's optimized for student learning. There's something standing in the way of improving the competitiveness of our students: the teachers' unions. The teachers' unions control the school calendar, prevent us from paying better teachers more, stop principals from firing bad teachers, and even control what our teachers are allowed to teach our children. The teachers' unions insist that it is your fault, that our K through 12 system is failing. You, the greedy taxpayer. Of course, they tell us everything would be better if we just spent more money on education, but throwing more money at the problem isn't really the answer. In fact, Microsoft founder Bill Gates recently admitted to the Wall Street Journal that the $5 billion he spent trying to improve K through 12 education in America yielded very few measurable improvements at all. And Apple's immortal entrepreneur, Steve Jobs, reportedly told President Obama shortly before his death that until the teachers' unions can be broken, there is almost no hope for educational reform. But at least we're getting the best teachers, right? Well, no. Just ask the young middle school teacher who won the Teacher of the Year award at the end of her second year teaching in New Jersey. After she received the award, she was fired. Why fire the Teacher of the Year? Because union rules dictate that the most recently hired teachers must be laid off first, which is known as last in, first out. The teachers' union set the rules that dictate that if a school district wants to keep great new teachers, it has to keep all the teachers who were hired before them, regardless of quality or performance. Under virtually all union contracts, school principals can't lay off their worst performers while keeping their best ones. The National Education Association, which is America's largest labor union, and the smaller American Federation of Teachers, which together controls so much of our education system, put out the message that education is underfunded in America and that our teachers are underpaid. In reality, we spend more than almost any other nation on our children's education, and the average salary for our public school teachers is significantly higher than the median average personal income in the United States, not even taking into account the extensive vacation time and the better-than-average benefits that teachers receive. By asking us all for more money for education, the teachers' unions try to shift the blame for our failing K through 12 education system from their shoulders to ours. Back in a minute. Thank you. Final frontier. This is an America run by the government employee unions, and it's only getting worse. After World War II, over 35% of workers in the private sector were union members. Today, private sector union membership clocks in below 7%. To keep the money flowing and their coffers full, labor unions have had to seek out new frontiers. They found their frontier. It's our government. In this book, you'll learn how unions now hold power over our government workers at the federal, state, and local levels. You'll learn how these unions are destroying our rule of law and free elections. You'll find out why Obama is the perfect partner for government employee unions. And you'll learn how the teachers' unions control America's classrooms in all 50 states. You'll discover what it's like to be a member of a government employee union, what the union does for you, and what it does to you. You'll also learn why government employee unions spend so much of their dues income on politics and about the corruption and coercion within the unions themselves. You'll find out what's coming next, how their ultimate goal is to make you a member of a government employee union, with or without your permission, and how they intend to stop any politicians or groups that oppose them. You may recall the Philosopher's Stone. the elusive substance that was believed by the ancients to be able to turn metal into gold. For the labor unions, it's no myth. Government employee unions are the philosopher's stone, turning every government employees into gold for the labor union movement. All they have to do is continue to mobilize the net pie receipts to support their agenda and elect their candidates. For the past half century, they've been winning. Unions' power and privilege is always ratcheted up, never down, toward greater union power, never less. Our job is to reverse that pattern. As President Ronald Reagan wrote in 1985, someone must stand up to those who say, here's the key, here's the treasury, just take as many of those hard-earned tax dollars as you want. If there's ever been a time in our history to stand up for the American taxpayer against government employee unions, it is now. Let's get started. And that was the introduction to the book called The Shadowbosses. And next time will be Chapter 1, Meet the Shadowbosses. Thank you. Who is the socialist? He is the man that is spiritual. He's the man that seeks consensus. He's subjective, petty, and small, taking everything in life personally. He's outrageous, boring, and rude. He pretends to be a leader and a change agent. He pretends that he's your friend. He is sly, cunning, and deceptive. He dresses, acts, and speaks like a slob. He is informal and terminally unique. He is childish and pretends that he knows nothing. He has no conscience and pretends that might makes right and that the ends justify the means. He is impulsive and rationalizes his behavior. He is deterministic, blaming others for his mistakes. He is skeptical, demanding that others solve his problems. His unreasonableness and irresponsibility make him a bad role model, bad father, brother, family member, friend, and a bad person, period. So if you think that you can be friends with a socialist, think again. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you to tune in to the John and Ken Show, which is an excellent example of how true conservatives communicate. It's a radio show that's on KFI AM 640 from 2 o'clock in the afternoon to 6 o'clock in the evening, Monday through Friday. And that's Pacific time. So that's an excellent show to listen to. And other than that, until next time, remember to be honest, to be smart, to be beautiful, and to remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.